The term the Third World is used to describe those countries which are neither part of the First World of the capitalist West, nor of the Second World of the Communist bloc. But as a phrase, the Third World is considered patronizing by some people, so we also speak of the developed North and the developing South, Central and South America, Africa, the Middle East and Asia. What countries of the Third World have in common is that all of them are searching for the best, most effective ways to develop, in spite of their great problems of poverty. However, there are huge contrasts within the Third World itself. Great skyscraper cities and wealth, alongside desperate poverty. The application of new technology, together with ancient and sometimes primitive ways of doing things. Thus, the Third World includes bustling Singapore, as well as rural India, oil-rich Saudi Arabia, drought-stricken Ethiopia, and South America's giant, Brazil, a potential superpower of the 21st century. The Third World emerged during the 1950s as a reaction to two worldwide events of historic importance. These were the ending of the European empires and the division between the West and the communist countries described by Winston Churchill in 1946.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Both events have dominated world politics ever since. The end of empires meant that about 100 new nations have appeared on the world stage. Episodes in the Cold War, like the Berlin airlift in 1948, have divided our world, produced great military and other tensions, and threatened it with nuclear war. The United Nations organization had been formed in 1945 by 50 countries. There were high hopes of establishing an effective new world order. By 1980, membership of the United Nations had increased to 150, and almost all these new members saw themselves as belonging to the third or developing world. The United Nations, in consequence, provided a platform for these new countries, a place where the weak states could put their case and try to influence the policies of the great powers. But rivalries between the world's two greatest powers and distrust of each other's aims produced the Cold War. This was to split the world into two camps: the Western capitalist democracies, led by the United States, and the Communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union.
In my opinion,
It was the American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles whose theme in the 1950s that "you're either with us or against us" meant that the new states had to choose sides. The two blocs in the Cold War looked for allies among the newly independent nations. These new states, however, didn't wish to commit themselves to either side in the Cold War. They wanted instead to keep their newfound freedom of choice, their non-alignment as it came to be called. On their own, however, they were too weak to resist the pressures of the big powers. They needed to act together. In 1955, delegates from the Third World, including Pandit Nehru of India and Zhou Enlai of China, met at Bandung in Indonesia. Here they made plain that their countries were not willing to be agents of the great powers, and it was here, in Bandung, that non-alignment was born. These uncommitted countries argued that they faced enough problems of development to engage all their energies. Since then, almost all the Third World countries have insisted, at least in theory, that they are non-aligned. In 1956, 1 year after the Bandung Conference, the two leading colonial powers, Britain and France, invaded Egypt in what became known as the Suez Crisis. This followed Colonel Nasser of Egypt nationalizing the Suez Canal. This was the last major attempt to discipline a small power by old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy. But the two powers found themselves largely isolated. The non-aligned countries gave solid support to Nasser's Egypt and applauded his defiance of the old imperial powers. The crisis strengthened the idea of non-alignment among third world countries. It also hastened the end of empires. The ending of empires, which began with British India in 1947, now speeded up dramatically and spread to Africa. In 1945, this great continent was almost entirely divided between the colonial powers. Then, in 1960, 17 African colonies became independent as new states. But the independence of Africa didn't happen without bloodshed and hard political struggles. In Algeria, a bitter war was fought between the French and the Algerians before that country became independent. And in Kenya, there was the long Mau Mau emergency before the achievement of independence in 1963, when Jomo Kenyatta, who'd been imprisoned by the British, became the country's first president. By the early 1960s, world divisions had become clear. There were the first and second worlds of the capitalist West and the communist East, facing each other in their Cold War confrontation. And there was the rapidly expanding third world, which, despite pressures from the first and second worlds, was determined not to join either side, but to maintain its stand of non-alignment. The voice of the third world was increasingly being heard in the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, and through the non-aligned movement. But the third world is enormously varied. The countries of Latin America had enjoyed more than a century of independence, and at least parts of this huge region were highly developed, whereas Africa was the newest and generally poorest region of the third world. The Middle East had great wealth from its oil, but until the 1970s this was largely controlled by international companies, and the oil-producing countries got little benefit from it. Asia included not only the world's two giants, India and China, but also small, economically thrusting states like South Korea and Singapore. The phrase rich and poor has been used to describe the difference between the countries of the North and South. Yet it's far from easy to deal with the problems of the third world. These are many. The poor countries do not have enough educated or skilled people, so they're constantly obliged to seek help from the North in the form of technical assistance. They do not have enough capital to develop their resources, so they borrow from the North. Aid may take the form of loans and grants, or be provided as technical assistance, skilled people passing on their knowledge. But the motives for aid are mixed, and a country providing it may be just as concerned to safeguard its own interests, such as its investments, as to help the recipient overcome its development problems. The result of this is the accumulation of huge debts, which the third world often has difficulty in repaying. One way to understand the problems of the third world is to look at what the North, the advanced economies, take for granted. In countries such as Britain, schools for all, electric light, pure tap water, and hospital services are all part of everyday life. But the realities in countries of the South may be very different. Many third world countries are over-dependent upon one or two commodities for export, such as copper from Zambia, coffee from Kenya, This often means that their economies are at the mercy of world price movements beyond their control. For instance, development plans based on a high price for coffee exports had to be revised halfway through because the export price of coffee had gone down. Then the rate of development slows down. Even oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, which did so well in the 1970s, faced a world oil glut in the 1980s and found their incomes had been halved. But immense strides have been made with health. Many third world countries have achieved levels of health and health care over the last 25 years that have transformed the lives of their people. However, much remains to be done. For example, a new hospital may be built as a result of aid. Yet later, lack of funds may mean it has no adequate supplies of drugs. In any case, too many hospitals have been built in capital cities, when what's really needed are rural clinics. Another result of medical advances has been the huge boom in population. As a result of this population explosion, some third world countries find that all the development advances they make, for example producing more food, are swallowed up, because every year they have a greater number of extra mouths to feed. Instead of advancing, therefore, they just stand still. India, with nearly 700 million people, adds about the equivalent of Britain's entire population to her own in every 5 or 6 years. Almost all third world countries have recognized that education is one of the keys to progress. Most of them have given it high priority. But sometimes there's been too much academic training in countries where 80% of the students will spend their lives working as farmers. Or education has produced too many students with high expectations which their societies cannot meet. Such students often become the focus of opposition to government policies. At the same time, in countries like Brazil and India, many millions remain illiterate. It'll be years before all children even have the chance to go to school at all. As we've seen, most developing countries have been forced to borrow money to finance their development. They seek it from countries like the United States, Britain or France, or from the World Bank. If the terms of trade go against them, they face balance of payments difficulties. Then they may go, for example, to the International Monetary Fund for short-term loans. But they may find they can only get help if they adopt policies demanded by the rich countries of the North. They have the money, and as a rule, they dictate the terms upon which they lend.
Corrective policy measures are already underway in many countries, but considerably more adjustment is needed if external deficits are to be brought down and debt crises avoided. When debt problems do arise, however, there has to be a close collaboration amongst all the interested parties. The need for that close collaboration has been made strikingly evident by the current developments in Mexico.
There's been much political turmoil in third world countries since independence. The departing colonial powers left behind various political systems, yet only after independence could the politicians work out what best suited their own people. India, 40 years after independence, remains a democracy, the world's largest. But in other countries there have been civil wars and coups. In some, the military have seized power. Others have become one-party states. And often, in the course of this difficult search for political stability, human rights have been violated or curtailed. There have been no easy solutions. In 1973, following the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states, OPEC, led by the powerful Sheikh Yamani of Saudi Arabia, quadrupled the price of oil. This made a big impact upon the Western economies. As a result, for a while at least, the rich North was obliged to listen to the pleas of the poor South for a fairer world economic system. Talks between the two sides were held in Paris, and the idea of a North-South dialogue was born. For the first time, or so it seemed, the countries of the Third World, at least those which possessed the oil that the developed nations wanted so badly, could speak on something like equal terms with the rich nations of the North. In Algeria, at the 1975 United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, representatives of the developing nations pressed for a better deal from the Western industrial countries. Oil power, so it was thought, could be used to force the advanced economies of the North to make concessions. As a result, it was hoped that, somehow, there'd be brought about a fairer, more equitable distribution of the world's wealth. Out of the oil crisis and these meetings came the Brandt Report. This report was chaired by the former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Its recommendations were published under the title North-South, a Programme for Survival. The report's main theme was that we live in an interdependent world, that rich and poor, or North and South, need each other. But by the time the report was published, the world was already moving into recession, and so far, little has been done about the report's recommendations. When third world countries face hard times or disasters, unlike the rich, they have few resources to fall back upon. The terrible effects of the drought in Ethiopia brought home to many in the West just how much such countries are at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Yet a great deal of progress has been made. The products of some third world countries like Brazil, South Korea, or Singapore now compete successfully with our own. Yet, despite such progress, the world's wealth remains concentrated overwhelmingly in the hands of the North, and predominantly in the capitalist countries of the West. It's here that most economic decisions of any importance are made. The message of the Brandt Report is that we belong to an interdependent world. But the problems of development in the Third World cannot easily be solved. It remains for the rich North to decide the terms on which it continues to give help to the countries of the South. Help without which the Third World could not develop.